The small grocery store on Pine Street wasn't usually busy on Tuesday afternoons, but something about this particular day felt different. Maybe it was the unusual autumn heat, or perhaps it was fate stepping in to write a story that would change multiple lives forever. Alex Chen, a 17-year-old high school student, stood behind the register, absent-mindedly reorganizing the candy display while keeping an eye on the few customers browsing the aisles. Working part-time at his uncle's store wasn't exactly thrilling, but it helped put some money in his pocket and gave him something to do after school. The bell above the door chimed, and Alex looked up to see Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez slowly making their way inside. The elderly couple had been regular customers for as long as Alex could remember. Mrs. Rodriguez always wore her favorite blue cardigan, while Mr. Rodriguez never went anywhere without his worn military veteran cap. They were the kind of people who remembered everyone's birthday and always had a kind word to share. "Good afternoon, Alex," Mrs. Rodriguez called out, her voice warm and familiar. "Such a hot day today, isn't it?" Alex smiled and walked around the counter to help them with their shopping cart. "It sure is, Mrs. Rodriguez. Let me help you with that." He'd noticed lately that Mr. Rodriguez had been having trouble with his hip, though the proud veteran never complained. As the couple slowly made their way through the store, Alex kept an eye on them while attending to other customers. They were taking longer than usual today, carefully checking prices and putting back several items. Alex had noticed this happening more frequently lately, and it made his heart heavy. He knew times were tough for many people, especially those living on fixed incomes. The bell chimed again, and 3 young men walked in. Something about them immediately put Alex on edge. They wore expensive sneakers and designer clothes, but their body language screamed trouble. They spread out through the store, pretending to browse while shooting furtive glances at each other. Alex's uncle had trained him well for situations like this. "Keep calm, but stay alert," he'd always said. "Your safety comes first, but sometimes just letting people know you see them is enough to prevent trouble." The tallest of the 3 made his way to the aisle where the Rodriguez couple was shopping. Alex watched as the man deliberately bumped into their cart, causing Mrs. Rodriguez to stumble slightly. "Watch where you put your cart, old lady," the man sneered, loud enough for his friends to snicker. Mr. Rodriguez straightened up as much as his bad hip would allow. "Young man, there's no need for that kind of behavior. Please apologize to my wife." The situation was escalating quickly. The other 2 troublemakers were now moving closer, and Alex could see the fear in Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes. Without hesitation, he pressed the silent alarm button under the counter, another of his uncle's safety measures, and walked quickly toward the aisle. "Is everything okay here?" Alex asked, keeping his voice steady despite his racing heart. He positioned himself slightly in front of the elderly couple, making direct eye contact with the tall troublemaker. "Mind your own business, kid," one of the other men said, stepping closer. "We're just having a friendly conversation with Grandma and Grandpa here." Alex felt his hands trembling slightly, but he stood his ground. "Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez are valued customers here. I'm going to have to ask you all to leave the store now." The tall one took a step forward, towering over Alex. "Or what?" In that moment, Alex noticed something he hadn't before. The security camera in the corner was clearly visible, and its red light was blinking. He smiled slightly. "Or the police will be here in about 2 minutes to review our security footage. They're pretty quick to respond to our silent alarm." The mention of security footage changed the atmosphere instantly. The troublemakers exchanged glances, their bravado deflating slightly. The tall one muttered something under his breath and gestured to his friends. They quickly made their way out of the store, but not before the last one knocked over a display of canned goods near the door. As the bell chimed their departure, Alex let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He turned to the Rodriguez couple, concerned. "Are you both okay?" Mrs. Rodriguez had tears in her eyes as she reached for Alex's hand. "Oh, Alex, you're such a brave boy." "Thank you." Mr. Rodriguez nodded solemnly. "You showed real courage there, son. Not many would stand up to those thugs." Alex helped them pick out the rest of their groceries, noticing again how they carefully checked each price. When they reached the register, he pretended to scan several items while actually marking them as damaged in the system, something he'd never done before, but today felt different. His uncle would understand. As the couple left the store, Alex watched them slowly make their way down the street. He felt good about standing up to the troublemakers, but something else was bothering him. The way the Rodriguez couple had been shopping lately, putting back essential items, it wasn't right. They were good people who'd spent their lives helping others. There had to be something more he could do. Little did Alex know, his actions that day hadn't gone unnoticed. A sleek black SUV had been parked across the street, its tinted windows concealing the occupants who had witnessed everything. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across Pine Street, the SUV pulled away silently, carrying with it plans that would soon change many lives. That night, as Alex helped his uncle close the store, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. He had no way of knowing that his simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would not only transform his life but also impact his entire community in ways he could never have imagined. His uncle noticed his thoughtful expression as they locked up. "Everything okay? I heard about what happened today." Alex nodded slowly, watching the street lights flicker on. "Yeah, just thinking about the Rodriguez couple. They've been struggling lately, haven't they?" His uncle put a hand on his shoulder. "Good heart, good eyes. Sometimes seeing the problem is the first step to fixing it." He paused, then added, "You did good today, nephew. Real good." As they walked to their cars, neither of them noticed the black SUV that had returned, now parked in the shadows at the far end of the street. Its occupants were making a phone call that would set tomorrow's events in motion. The next morning arrived with a peculiar mix of fog and sunshine, casting an almost dreamlike quality over Pine Street. Alex arrived early at the store, his mind still dwelling on yesterday's events. As he helped his uncle unload the morning delivery, he couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Rodriguez putting back that small bottle of her favorite apple juice. It was only $3, but he'd seen the resignation in her eyes when she'd checked the price. "You're quiet today," his uncle observed, breaking into his thoughts. "Still thinking about yesterday?" Alex nodded, stacking cans on the shelf. "Uncle James, what do you know about the Rodriguez couple? They've been coming here forever, but lately." His uncle paused, leaning against the counter. Mr. Rodriguez worked at the city's manufacturing plant for 40 years before it closed down. Their pension got cut when the company went bankrupt. He sighed, shaking his head. "They're too proud to ask for help, but I've heard they've been having trouble with medical bills. Mrs. Rodriguez's arthritis medicine isn't cheap." The bell chimed, interrupting their conversation. Alex turned, expecting their usual morning coffee regulars, but instead found himself facing two people who looked distinctly out of place in their small neighborhood store. A tall woman in a crisp business suit and a younger man carrying a leather briefcase stood in the doorway, their presence immediately commanding attention. "Are you Alex Chen?" the woman asked, her voice professional but warm. Alex exchanged a quick glance with his uncle before responding. "Yes, that's me." The woman smiled, extending her hand. "I'm Linda Thompson from the Wellington Foundation. This is my colleague, David Park. We'd like to speak with you about yesterday's incident." Alex's uncle stepped forward protectively. "What's this about?" "Something wonderful, actually," Linda replied, reaching into her briefcase. She pulled out a business card with an elegant gold logo. "The Wellington Foundation specializes in community development and support for local heroes. We have security footage from across the street showing everything that happened yesterday." Alex's heart skipped a beat. The black SUV, these must be the people who were watching. Your nephew's actions impressed us, David added, but what really caught our attention was what happened after the confrontation. We saw him helping the elderly couple with their shopping, and our investigation revealed a pattern of similar acts of kindness in this community. Linda nodded. We've been looking for the right project in this area, and we believe we found it. We'd like to help the Rodriguez couple, but we'd also like to do something bigger for the community. And we want Alex to be part of it. Alex's uncle frowned slightly. What exactly are you proposing? We'd like to establish a community support program, Linda explained, starting with helping seniors in the neighborhood. The foundation would provide the funding, but we need someone who knows the community, someone who has demonstrated both courage and compassion. Someone like Alex. The bell chimed again, and everyone turned to see Mr. Rodriguez making his way into the store. He looked surprised at the gathering but gave his usual friendly wave. Good morning, everyone, he said, making his way to the counter. In his hand was a small envelope. Alex, I wanted to give you this. It's not much, just a thank you card from Mrs. Rodriguez and me. She spent all evening making it. Alex took the envelope, touched by the gesture. Inside was a handmade card decorated with carefully drawn flowers. Mrs. Rodriguez's slightly shaky handwriting expressed their gratitude, calling him their guardian angel. Linda and David exchanged meaningful looks. Mr. Rodriguez, Linda said gently, would you mind joining our conversation? We'd like to hear more about your experience in this community. Over the next hour, as regular customers came and went, a remarkable discussion unfolded. Mr. Rodriguez shared stories about the neighborhood's history, about families who'd lived there for generations, and about how things had changed when the manufacturing plant closed. His voice carried no bitterness, only a deep love for his community and concern for his neighbors who were struggling like him and his wife. The young people are leaving, he said sadly. There's nothing to keep them here anymore. But Alex, he reminds me of how things used to be, when neighbors looked out for each other. Linda leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. What if we could change that? What if we could create opportunities right here, starting with a program to support seniors and then expanding to youth employment and community development? Alex listened intently as Linda outlined the foundation's proposal. They wanted to start a pilot program, using his uncle's store as a hub. The foundation would provide funding for basic necessities for seniors in need, but more importantly, they wanted to create a system where young people could earn money by helping seniors with errands, home maintenance, and companionship. We'll need someone to coordinate it all, David added, looking meaningfully at Alex. Someone who can work part-time while finishing school, someone who knows both the young people and the seniors in the community. Alex felt overwhelmed by the possibility. But I'm just a high school student. His uncle placed a hand on his shoulder. You're more than that, nephew. You've got something special, you see people, really see them. That's rare. Mr. Rodriguez nodded in agreement. He's right, son. Sometimes the best leaders are the ones who don't realize they're leading, they just do what's right. As the conversation continued, more regular customers trickled in, each adding their own perspective to the discussion. The store became more than just a store, it transformed into a community gathering place, buzzing with hope and possibility. By the time Linda and David prepared to leave, the fog outside had lifted completely, leaving behind a brilliantly clear day. They left Alex with a folder full of information and a head full of dreams, promising to return tomorrow with more detailed plans. After they left, Alex helped Mr. Rodriguez with his shopping, his mind racing with possibilities. As he watched the elderly man leave the store, he noticed the black SUV was back, parked discreetly across the street. But this time, instead of feeling mysterious, its presence felt promising, like the beginning of something extraordinary. His uncle came to stand beside him, looking out the store window. You know, he said thoughtfully, sometimes life's biggest changes start with the smallest acts of kindness. Yesterday, you stood up for what was right. Today, it looks like that small action might change everything. Alex nodded, watching as Mr. Rodriguez made his way home, walking a little straighter than usual, as if he too could feel the weight of possibility in the air. The future suddenly seemed full of promise, not just for the Rodriguez couple, but for the entire community. Little did Alex know, the Wellington Foundation's plans were even bigger than they'd revealed, and tomorrow would bring revelations that would exceed anything he could have imagined. Sleep didn't come easily to Alex that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling fan slowly spinning above him, his mind replaying the day's events. The folder from the Wellington Foundation sat on his desk, its contents promising to change not just his life, but the lives of so many others in his community. The next morning arrived with unexpected chaos. Alex walked into the store to find his uncle in an animated discussion with Mrs. Rodriguez, who looked more distressed than he'd ever seen her. "He's been at the hospital all night," Mrs. Rodriguez was saying, her hands trembling around her coffee cup. "His hip just gave out completely. The doctors say he needs surgery, but our insurance..." She trailed off, tears welling in her eyes. Alex's heart sank. Mr. Rodriguez had been struggling with that hip for months, trying to avoid the inevitable. Before anyone could say more, the store's bell chimed. Linda and David from the Wellington Foundation walked in, followed by an elderly gentleman Alex hadn't seen before. His suit was impeccably tailored, and despite his age, he carried himself with remarkable energy. "Good morning," Linda said, then noticed Mrs. Rodriguez's distress. "Is everything all right?" The elderly gentleman stepped forward, his keen eyes taking in the scene. "Perhaps we should all sit down. I'm Richard Wellington," he said quietly. "And I believe we have much to discuss." Alex's uncle quickly brought out chairs from the back room, setting them up in a corner of the store. As they sat, Richard Wellington's presence seemed to fill the small space with a sense of purpose. "I rarely make these visits personally," he began, "but when I saw the security footage from 2 days ago, something struck me. It wasn't just the young man's courage," he nodded toward Alex, "but the way this store serves as a heart for the community. It reminded me of something I'd almost forgotten." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old, worn photograph. "This was my grandfather's store, not too different from this one, about 60 years ago. He taught me that a store isn't just a business, it's a lifeline, a gathering place, a foundation for community. When he passed away, I promised myself I'd never forget that lesson." Mrs. Rodriguez wiped her eyes, listening intently as Richard continued. "The foundation was created to help communities like this one, but we've become too corporate, too distant. When Linda showed me the footage of Alex standing up to those troublemakers, protecting you and your husband, Mrs. Rodriguez, I knew we'd found something special. Not just a young man with courage, but a community worth investing in." Linda opened her laptop, pulling up a presentation. "What we're proposing is bigger than what we discussed yesterday. We want to create a comprehensive community revival program, starting with medical assistance for seniors like Mr. Rodriguez." Mrs. Rodriguez's hand flew to her mouth. "You mean?" "We've already contacted the hospital," David explained gently. "Mr. Rodriguez's surgery will be fully covered by our medical assistance program. But that's just the beginning." Richard stood up and walked to the store window, looking out at the street. "This neighborhood has good bones, as they say. Strong people, real connections. What it needs is support and opportunity." He turned back to face them. "We're prepared to commit significant resources to create what we're calling the Pine Street Renaissance Project." Over the next hour, they outlined a plan that seemed almost too good to be true. The foundation would establish a medical assistance fund for seniors, renovate empty storefronts for new businesses, create job training programs for young people, and set up a community center in the abandoned manufacturing plant building. "But we need local leadership," Linda emphasized. People who know the community, who care about it. Alex, we'd like you to head up the youth engagement program. It would be a paid position, part-time while you're in school, full-time during summers. Alex's uncle spoke up for the first time. This all sounds wonderful, but why here? Why us? Richard Wellington smiled. Because sometimes the smallest moments reveal the biggest truths. That security footage showed me something remarkable, not just Alex's courage, but the way people in this store interact, the way they care for each other. You can't manufacture that kind of community spirit, you can only nurture it. Mrs. Rodriguez suddenly stood up. I need to get to the hospital. Carlos will want to know. She was crying again, but this time they were tears of joy. I'll drive you, Linda offered immediately. David can stay here to work out more details. As they prepared to leave, Richard Wellington turned to Alex. You know, son, when I was about your age, someone took a chance on me. They saw something in me that I didn't see in myself. Now I'm doing the same for you, but with one condition. Alex straightened up. What's that, sir? Never lose that instinct to help others. Money and success are important tools, but they're not what makes a life worthwhile. What you did 2 days ago, standing up for what's right, helping those in need, that's what really matters. After they left, Alex and his uncle stood in silence for a moment, trying to process everything that had happened. The store seemed different somehow, as if the very air was charged with possibility. You okay, nephew? His uncle asked softly. Alex nodded slowly. It's just, everything's changing so fast. 2 days ago, I was just a kid working in his uncle's store. Now. His uncle smiled. Now you're still that same kid, just with a bigger chance to do what you were already doing, helping people. Don't let the size of the opportunity frighten you. Just keep doing what comes naturally. Throughout the day, regular customers came and went, each one adding their own reactions to the news that was quickly spreading through the neighborhood. The abandoned manufacturing plant would come alive again. There would be jobs, training, support for those who needed it. By closing time, Alex's phone was full of messages from classmates who'd heard about the youth program. The Rodriguez couple's daughter had called from out of state, crying with gratitude about her father's surgery. The local newspaper wanted to do an interview. As Alex helped his uncle close up, a familiar black SUV pulled up outside. But this time, instead of watching mysteriously from a distance, Linda stepped out and waved. Get some rest, she called out. Tomorrow, we start planning the future. Alex watched her drive away, then turned to look at the store, really look at it. The slightly faded sign, the worn but clean windows, the warm light spilling onto the sidewalk. His uncle was right, he was still the same person he'd been 3 days ago. But now he had the chance to turn his small acts of kindness into something bigger, something that could help transform an entire community. As they walked to their cars, the street lights flickered on, casting long shadows that seemed to dance with possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to make a difference. But for now, Alex was content knowing that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices, like standing up for what's right, even when you're scared. The following week passed in a whirlwind of activity. The small grocery store had become the unofficial headquarters for the Pine Street Renaissance Project, with a steady stream of Wellington Foundation representatives coming and going. But today was different. Today was Alex's first official day as youth program coordinator. He arrived early, dressed in what his mother called his responsible clothes, a neat button-down shirt and khakis. His uncle took one look at him and chuckled. You know you're still going to have to stock shelves, right? I know, Alex replied, tugging at his collar. I just want to look the part. The morning sun had barely cleared the buildings when the first group of young people started arriving. Alex had spent the weekend reaching out to his classmates and other local teens, and the response had been overwhelming. 20 young faces looked back at him expectantly as he stood before them in the community room the foundation had quickly set up in an empty storefront next door. "So, thanks for coming," Alex began, his voice shakier than he'd like. He took a deep breath, remembering what Linda had told him, "Just speak from the heart." "Look, we all know this neighborhood has been struggling. But that's about to change, and we get to be part of that change. The foundation is offering paid positions for youth volunteers to help seniors in our community. It's not just about the money, it's about rebuilding connections." As Alex spoke, he felt his confidence growing. He explained the program structure. Teams of 2 would be assigned to help seniors with various tasks: grocery shopping, yard work, basic home maintenance, or simply providing companionship. Each team would work 10 hours per week, with flexible scheduling around school hours. "The best part," he continued, "is that we're not just helping others, we're learning valuable skills. The foundation will provide training in basic home repair, first aid, and even business management for those interested." A hand shot up. It belonged to Raj, a quiet kid from Alex's chemistry class. "What if we don't know how to do any of that stuff?" "That's the point," Alex smiled. "We'll learn together. In fact." He glanced at his watch. "Our first training session starts in about 20 minutes. Mr. Rodriguez is coming home from the hospital today, and we're going to help prepare his house." The next scene unfolded at the Rodriguez home, where Linda supervised as the young volunteers learned to install grab bars in the bathroom, adjust door handles for easier gripping, and create clear pathways for a walker. Alex watched in amazement as his peers, some of whom he'd barely spoken to before, worked together with enthusiasm. Mrs. Rodriguez moved through the house like a proud grandmother, offering cookies and sharing stories about the neighborhood's history. Her eyes welled up when she saw the modifications being made to help her husband's recovery. "Your grandfather would be proud," she told Alex, patting his hand. "He always said you had his spirit." Alex was surprised. "You knew my grandfather?" "Oh yes," she smiled. "He was one of the first people to welcome us when we moved here 40 years ago. Back then, some people weren't so welcoming to families like ours. But your grandfather said character was what mattered, not where someone came from." The moment was interrupted by a commotion from the kitchen. 2 of the volunteers had accidentally knocked over a box while moving the kitchen table. As they scrambled to pick up the scattered contents, Alex noticed they were old photographs. Mrs. Rodriguez hurried over. "Oh, be careful with those." She picked up one photo and showed it to the group. This was Pine Street during its heyday. "Look at all the shops, the people on the sidewalks. Every Saturday, there was a street market right here." The teens gathered around, fascinated by this glimpse into their neighborhood's past. In the photo, Pine Street was vibrant and alive, with strings of lights crossing the street and shop fronts gleaming with fresh paint. Linda, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "You know, there's no reason we couldn't bring that back. The foundation's renovation plans include restoring the street to its original character." "But better," Alex added, an idea forming. "What if we combined the old with the new? Like, what if we had a weekly market, but also included spaces for young entrepreneurs to sell things they make or services they offer?" The room buzzed with sudden energy as the teens started sharing ideas. One girl talked about her sister's homemade jewelry, another mentioned his brother's web design business. Even Raj, still quiet but more engaged, suggested they could offer tech support for seniors trying to connect with faraway family through video calls. As the afternoon wore on, Alex noticed something remarkable happening. The teens who had arrived that morning as individuals were now working in natural teams, making plans, exchanging phone numbers. The Rodriguez home had become more than just their first project, it was the catalyst for real community transformation. Around 4 o'clock, a familiar black SUV pulled up outside. Mr. Rodriguez was coming home from the hospital. Alex watched from the porch as Mrs. Rodriguez hurried to greet her husband, who was using a walker but looking stronger than he had in weeks. Mr. Rodriguez paused at the front walk, taking in the scene, young people coming in and out of his house, tools and supplies scattered across the lawn, the new ramp leading to his porch. His eyes met Alex's, and there was understanding in that look, understanding that this was about more than just home modifications or youth employment. "Welcome home, Mr. Rodriguez," Alex said, helping him up the ramp. "Wait until you see what everyone's been doing." As Mr. Rodriguez toured his modified home, his eyes growing misty at each thoughtful adaptation, Alex stepped outside for a moment. The late afternoon sun cast a golden light on Pine Street, and for the first time, he could see it not just as it was, but as it could be. The empty storefronts wouldn't be empty much longer. The quiet sidewalks would soon buzz with activity. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda: "Richard Wellington is coming tomorrow. He wants to see how day one went. But more importantly, he has news about the manufacturing plant." Big news. Alex looked back into the Rodriguez home, where teens and seniors were sharing stories and snacks, where barriers of age and background were dissolving in the warmth of shared purpose. Whatever tomorrow's news might be, he knew that the real transformation had already begun. It wasn't just about the physical changes to the neighborhood, or even the economic opportunities. It was about something his grandfather had understood, something Mr. Wellington had recognized in that security footage, something that had been there all along, waiting to be awakened: the power of community, of people coming together to help each other, of small acts of kindness growing into something bigger than themselves. As the sun set on Pine Street, Alex could almost see his grandfather walking these sidewalks, welcoming newcomers, building bridges. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but for now, he was content knowing that the spirit of community his grandfather had nurtured was alive and well, ready to bloom again in the hearts of a new generation. Dawn broke over Pine Street with unusual energy in the air. Alex arrived at the store even earlier than usual, his mind racing with possibilities about Richard Wellington's news. He found his uncle already there, arranging a fresh display of local produce, another small change the foundation had helped implement, connecting the store with nearby farmers. "You're early," his uncle observed, handing him a coffee. "Nervous about the big meeting?" "A little," Alex admitted, taking a sip. "I just want everything to be perfect and Mr. Wellington arrives." The bell chimed, and both turned to see Mrs. Rodriguez entering, looking more energetic than she had in weeks. "You won't believe what happened last night," she announced, her eyes bright with excitement. "The young people who helped us yesterday? 2 of them came back in the evening to help Carlos with his physical therapy exercises. They learned them from the hospital videos, and they were so patient with him." Alex smiled, recognizing the visitors she described: Raj and his friend Lee, who had stayed behind after everyone else left, carefully noting down all the exercise instructions. They hadn't said anything about going back. Before he could respond, the sound of vehicles pulling up outside drew their attention. Through the window, they could see not just Richard Wellington's black SUV, but several other cars as well. People in business suits emerged, carrying folders and tablets. Richard Wellington entered first, followed by Linda and David, along with several others Alex didn't recognize. But what caught his attention was the large rolled-up architectural drawings they carried. "Good morning, everyone," Richard greeted them warmly. "I hope you don't mind, but I brought some friends who are very interested in what's happening here on Pine Street." The group made their way to the community room next door, which was quickly filling up with local residents who had heard about the meeting. Alex noticed Mr. Rodriguez among them, moving slowly with his walker but looking determined to be part of whatever was about to happen. Richard Wellington took center stage, his presence commanding attention without demanding it. "When I left here last week, I couldn't stop thinking about this community. About its history, its potential, and most importantly, its people. So I made some calls." He gestured to one of his companions, who began unrolling the architectural drawings on a table. These are the original blueprints of the manufacturing plant, dated 1950. And these, he pointed to another set of drawings, are what we envision for its future. The room fell silent as Richard outlined a vision that seemed almost too ambitious to be real. The manufacturing plant wouldn't just be renovated, it would be completely transformed into what he called the Pine Street Community Innovation Center. The ground floor will be a mixed-use space, he explained, pointing to different sections of the drawings. A marketplace for local vendors, workshop spaces for vocational training, and a community kitchen for culinary programs. The second floor will house technology labs, classrooms, and a business incubator for local entrepreneurs. One of the suited visitors stepped forward, introducing herself as Dr. Chen from the State University. We're particularly excited about the educational partnerships we're developing. Students will be able to earn college credits through dual enrollment programs right here in their community. Alex watched as faces around the room lit up with understanding. This wasn't just about renovating a building, it was about creating opportunities that would allow young people to stay in the neighborhood while bringing new life to the community. Richard continued, but here's what makes this project unique. The foundation isn't just providing funding, we're implementing a community ownership model. As programs become profitable, shares of ownership will be transferred to the community itself. He turned to Alex. Your youth program has already shown us how effective local leadership can be. In just one day, you've demonstrated what's possible when you give young people real responsibility and trust them to make a difference. Mrs. Rodriguez raised her hand. But what about the seniors? Many of us worked in that plant for decades. We don't want to be left behind in all this progress. Richard smiled. Actually, that's where we need your help the most. We want to create what we're calling the Community Memory Project. We'll be recording oral histories, documenting the neighborhood's heritage, and most importantly, creating mentorship programs where seniors can share their skills and experiences with younger generations. As the presentation continued, Alex noticed something remarkable happening in the room. People who had lived as neighbors for years but barely spoken to each other were now engaged in excited conversation, sharing ideas and making plans. The architectural drawings had become a gathering point, with small groups forming to discuss different aspects of the project. One of Richard's companions, introduced as a renewable energy specialist, explained how the renovated building would be powered by solar panels, creating jobs in green energy maintenance. Another spoke about urban farming initiatives on the building's roof. But it was Raj, speaking up unexpectedly from the back of the room, who captured the real significance of the moment. My parents always talked about moving to a better neighborhood, he said quietly. But now it feels like we can make our neighborhood better ourselves. Richard Wellington nodded approvingly. That's exactly the spirit we want to encourage. This isn't about the foundation coming in to fix things. It's about giving the community the tools and support to create its own future. As the meeting drew to a close, Richard pulled Alex aside. There's one more thing we haven't announced yet. The foundation is establishing a college scholarship fund for young people who participate in community development projects. You'll be our first recipient. Alex felt overwhelmed. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing, Richard replied. Sometimes the most important leadership isn't about making big speeches or grand gestures. It's about showing up every day and doing what needs to be done. Later that evening, after the visitors had left and the excitement had quieted down, Alex sat with his uncle on the store's front step. The architectural drawings, left behind for the community to review, were still fresh in his mind. It's really happening, isn't it? He said, watching the sunset paint the old manufacturing plant in shades of gold. His uncle nodded. You know what the best part is? None of this would have happened if you hadn't stood up for Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez that day. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest acts of courage. Down the street, they could see Mrs. Rodriguez helping Mr. Rodriguez with his evening walk, accompanied by 2 of the youth program volunteers. The sidewalk that had been nearly empty a week ago now held the promise of new life, new connections, and new possibilities. Alex's phone buzzed with messages from program participants sharing ideas for tomorrow's activities. The future was rushing toward them with incredible speed, but somehow, it felt less overwhelming now. Perhaps because he understood that they wouldn't be facing it alone, they would be facing it as a community. 2 weeks had passed since the big announcement, and Pine Street was barely recognizable. Construction crews worked steadily at the old manufacturing plant, their activities drawing curious onlookers throughout the day. But it wasn't just the physical changes that were transforming the neighborhood, it was the sense of purpose that seemed to fill the air. Alex stood in front of the store, watching a group of youth program volunteers helping an elderly couple unload groceries into their car. What had started with 20 teenagers had grown to 50, with more signing up every day. The sight made him smile, but there was also a knot of worry in his stomach. "You look troubled," a voice said behind him. He turned to find Mrs. Rodriguez, who was now walking with just a cane, her recovery aided by her dedicated young helpers. "The program's growing so fast," Alex admitted. "Sometimes I worry we're going to mess something up." Mrs. Rodriguez chuckled. "That's how you know you're doing something right. Growth always comes with growing pains." She was interrupted by the arrival of Linda's black SUV, which now seemed less mysterious and more like a familiar friend. Linda stepped out, followed by a film crew. "Alex," she called out. "Ready for your interview? The foundation wants to document the program's progress." Alex felt his mouth go dry. Public speaking wasn't his strong suit, and cameras made him nervous. But before he could respond, a commotion from down the street caught everyone's attention. A group of teenagers, not part of the program, were arguing loudly with some of the construction workers. Alex recognized them as the same troublemakers from the incident that had started everything. His heart sank as he hurried toward the scene, Linda and the film crew following close behind. "You can't just come in here and change everything," one of the boys was saying, his voice angry but with an undercurrent of something else, fear, maybe. "This is our neighborhood too." Alex approached carefully, remembering how their last encounter had ended. But this time was different. This time he wasn't just a store clerk, he was someone with responsibility, someone who needed to find a solution. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I remember you guys. Want to tell me what's really bothering you?" The tall one, their leader, turned to face him. "Oh, look who it is. The big hero." But the mockery in his voice seemed forced. "Not a hero," Alex replied. "Just someone trying to help make things better. Like those jobs they're offering at the Innovation Center, have you guys heard about those?" There was a moment of uncertain silence. Alex could feel the camera crew filming, but he forced himself to focus on the young men in front of him. "What jobs?" one of them asked finally. "Construction training program starts next week. Paid apprenticeships. But we also need people for the youth security team. You guys know the neighborhood better than anyone." The leader scoffed, but Alex could see he had their attention. "Security team? Yeah. The foundation believes in second chances. They also believe that sometimes the people who seem like troublemakers are actually natural leaders who just need an opportunity." Linda stepped forward. "He's right. In fact, we've been looking for people who understand the streets, who can help keep the peace while all these changes are happening." The tension in the air slowly began to dissipate. The construction workers returned to their tasks, and Alex found himself sitting on a nearby bench with the former troublemakers, explaining the various programs being developed. The film crew captured it all, but somehow their presence didn't seem important anymore. Later that afternoon, back at the store, Alex watched the playback of his impromptu intervention with Linda and his uncle. You handled that perfectly, Linda said. This is exactly why the foundation believes in youth leadership. You understood something we might have missed, that resistance to change often comes from fear of being left behind. His uncle nodded proudly. You gave them a chance to be part of the solution instead of treating them like a problem. The bell chimed, and Mr. Rodriguez entered, moving more confidently with his walker. Alex, you won't believe what's happening at the Innovation Center. They're installing the first solar panels today, and they want us seniors to learn how they work so we can teach the young people. Alex couldn't help but smile at Mr. Rodriguez's enthusiasm. The man who had seemed so defeated just weeks ago was now full of energy and purpose. That's not all, Mr. Rodriguez continued. Remember those boys you talked to this morning? 2 of them came by the center, asking about the security team program. One of them, the tall one, he helped me with my walker when I stumbled. Said his grandfather had used one before he passed away. The day continued to unfold with a mix of small victories and new challenges. The youth program participants were organizing a weekend cleanup event, the first of many community improvement projects they'd planned. The foundation's architects had set up a suggestion box for community input on the Innovation Center's design, and it was overflowing with ideas. As evening approached, Alex sat in the community room, surrounded by schedule sheets and program applications. The film crew had left, but their presence had made him realize something important. This wasn't just about one neighborhood anymore. What they were doing here could become a model for other communities. His phone buzzed with a message from Richard Wellington, saw the footage from today. This is exactly why we invested in Pine Street. Sometimes the best solutions come from the very people others might have written off. P.S. Wait until you see what we're announcing next week. Alex was about to respond when he heard music playing outside. He walked to the window and saw something unexpected. A group of teenagers, including some of the former troublemakers, had set up speakers in front of the Innovation Center. They were teaching some of the seniors how to use music production software on laptops provided by the foundation. Mrs. Rodriguez was there, laughing as she put on headphones, while her husband tapped his foot to the beat. The construction workers had stopped to watch, some of them nodding along. Even his uncle had come out of the store to join the impromptu gathering. Standing there, watching the scene unfold, Alex felt a subtle shift in his understanding. The transformation of Pine Street wasn't just about new buildings or programs or opportunities. It was about breaking down the barriers that had kept people apart, barriers of age, background, and assumption. His phone buzzed again, this time with a group message from the youth program participants. They were sharing photos of their day's activities, helping seniors with technology, teaching kids to grow vegetables in the new community garden, learning basic construction skills alongside the workers at the Innovation Center. Each image told a story of connection, of barriers being broken down, of a community rediscovering itself. Alex saved them all, knowing that someday these would be the before pictures in Pine Street's ongoing story of transformation. As the music played and the sun set behind the partially renovated manufacturing plant, Alex thought about the chain of events that had led to this moment. One small act of standing up for what was right had sparked something bigger than he could have imagined. But perhaps the real miracle wasn't in the big changes, it was in all the small moments of connection that were happening every day, weaving the community back together, one interaction at a time. The morning of Richard Wellington's next announcement arrived with unexpected visitors to the store. Alex was organizing the day's youth program schedules when he heard familiar voices that made him look up. His heart skipped a beat. It was the Rodriguez's children, all 3 of them, who had flown in from different parts of the country. We had to see it for ourselves, their daughter Maria explained, hugging Alex warmly. Mom and Dad's video calls have been full of nothing but stories about the changes here, but we couldn't quite believe it until we saw it. Their son Robert, a business consultant in Chicago, nodded in agreement. When Dad first got hurt, we tried to convince them to move closer to one of us. They refused to leave their home, and now we understand why. The youngest, Carmen, was recording everything on her phone. "I'm a social media manager," she explained. "This story needs to be shared. Communities everywhere should see what's possible when people come together like this." Before Alex could respond, the door chimed again. This time it was Raj and several other youth program participants, followed by the former troublemakers who had recently joined the security team. They were all wearing new uniforms with Pine Street Community Security emblazoned on the back. "Mr. Wellington's cars just turned onto Pine Street," Raj announced excitedly. "And there are news vans following them." Alex felt a flutter of nervousness. The foundation had been hinting at something big, but no one knew exactly what was coming. As people began gathering outside, he noticed something remarkable. The former troublemakers were actually helping to organize the crowd, ensuring the elderly residents had places to sit in the shade. The black SUVs pulled up, but this time Richard Wellington wasn't alone. As he stepped out, Alex recognized several state officials and what appeared to be federal representatives. Linda caught his eye and waved him over. "Alex," Richard greeted him warmly, "how fitting that the Rodriguez family is all here today. What we're about to announce started with your act of kindness toward their parents." The crowd grew as Richard Wellington took his place at the makeshift podium in front of the Innovation Center. The construction site had been transformed, with the first section of the building already gleaming with new windows and solar panels. "1 month ago," Richard began, "I watched a security video of a young man standing up to protect an elderly couple. That video led me here, and what I found was more than just a community in need of investment. I found a community with heart, with potential, and most importantly, with people who care about each other." He gestured to the partially renovated building behind him. "The Pine Street Innovation Center is just the beginning. Today, I'm pleased to announce that the federal government has selected Pine Street as a pilot location for the National Community Renewal Initiative." A murmur went through the crowd as Richard continued, "This means additional funding, resources, and support to expand what we've started here. But more importantly, it means that Pine Street will serve as a model for community revitalization across the country." Alex felt a hand on his shoulder. It was his uncle, beaming with pride. Around them, the excitement was palpable as Richard outlined the details of the initiative. The Innovation Center would now include a national training facility, where community leaders from other cities would come to learn from Pine Street's example. But it was the next announcement that brought tears to many eyes. "In recognition of the spirit that started all this," Richard said, "we're establishing the Rodriguezcan Community Leadership Scholarship. Each year, it will provide full college funding for young people who demonstrate the same kind of courage and compassion that Alex showed that day in the store." Mrs. Rodriguez, sitting in the front row with her husband and children, was openly crying. Mr. Rodriguez stood slowly, leaning on his walker, and made his way to the podium. Though no one had planned for him to speak, Richard stepped aside respectfully. "When I first came to this country, Mr. Rodriguez said, his voice strong despite his physical frailty, I had nothing but hope and a willingness to work hard. Pine Street gave me a home, a community, and a place to raise my family. Now, in my old age, when everything seemed to be fading away, this young man's simple act of kindness sparked something remarkable. It reminded us all that community isn't just about buildings or programs, it's about people caring for each other." As Mr. Rodriguez spoke, Alex noticed something extraordinary happening in the crowd. The youth program participants had naturally moved to stand near the elderly residents, ready to help if needed. The security team members, once seen as troublemakers, were efficiently managing the growing crowd with respect and courtesy. Carmen Rodriguez was capturing everything on her phone, but she paused to whisper to Alex, "Do you realize what you've started? This isn't just about Pine Street anymore. This is going to inspire people everywhere." After the formal announcements, as the crowd mingled and celebrated, Alex found himself surrounded by reporters. But before he could feel overwhelmed, he felt a familiar presence beside him, his uncle on one side, Mrs. Rodriguez on the other. Tell them the truth, his uncle said quietly. Tell them it all started with choosing to care. So Alex told the story, not of buildings or programs or funding, but of a community that had always had the potential for greatness, just waiting for someone to believe in it. He told them about Mr. Rodriguez's dignity in the face of hardship, about teenagers finding purpose in helping others, about former adversaries becoming protectors of the community. As the sun began to set on another transformative day on Pine Street, the Rodriguez children hosted an impromptu family dinner at their parents' house. But it wasn't just family. Alex and his uncle were there, along with Raj, the security team members, and other youth program participants who had become like extended family. Looking around the crowded dining room, Alex saw the true meaning of community. Maria was teaching some of the teenagers her grandmother's secret empanada recipe. Robert was discussing business plans with the security team members who wanted to start their own company someday. Carmen was showing Mrs. Rodriguez how to use social media to share her stories of Pine Street's history. His phone buzzed with a message from Linda. This is just the beginning. Wait until you see what tomorrow brings. Alex smiled, knowing that whatever came next, the spirit of Pine Street would only grow stronger. What had started as a simple act of standing up for what was right had blossomed into something extraordinary, not just a revitalized neighborhood, but a template for how communities everywhere could rebuild themselves through compassion, courage, and connection. 6 months had passed since that first day when Alex stood up to protect the Rodriguez couple in his uncle's store. Pine Street was hosting its first Community Innovation Festival, celebrating the completion of the Innovation Center's first phase. The once-abandoned manufacturing plant now stood as a beacon of hope, its solar panels gleaming in the autumn sunlight. The street was alive with activity. Vendors lined the sidewalks, many of them young entrepreneurs who had developed their businesses through the center's programs. The smell of various cuisines filled the air, traditional recipes passed down through generations now being served alongside modern fusion dishes created by culinary program students. Alex stood at the entrance of his uncle's store, now expanded and renovated, but still maintaining its heart as the community's gathering place. He watched Mr. Rodriguez, now walking with just a cane, leading a tour group of visitors from other cities. The elderly veteran had become one of the program's most passionate ambassadors. Remember this spot, Mr. Rodriguez was saying to his audience. This is where it all began, with one young man's choice to stand up for what was right. Now look around you, see what that single moment sparked. Indeed, the transformation was remarkable. The security team, led by the same young men who had once caused trouble, had become a model for community-based protection. They worked closely with local police, focusing on prevention and building relationships rather than confrontation. Raj, once the quietest student in school, now confidently ran the center's technology education program, teaching seniors how to connect with faraway family through video calls. He had even developed a simplified app specifically for elderly users, which was being considered for national distribution. The Rodriguez children had become regular visitors, each contributing their expertise. Maria had established a cultural preservation program, recording and sharing community stories. Robert provided business mentoring, while Carmen's social media campaigns had attracted national attention to Pine Street's renaissance. Alex, a familiar voice called. He turned to see Linda approaching, accompanied by Richard Wellington and several people he didn't recognize. The governor just arrived. She'd like to meet the young man who started all this. Before Alex could respond, he noticed a commotion near the community garden. A group of teenagers was helping an elderly woman who had stumbled. What caught his attention wasn't just their quick response, but how natural it seemed, no fanfare, no hesitation, just young people caring for their neighbors. You see that? Richard said softly, following Alex's gaze. That's the real success story here. Not the buildings, not the programs, but the change in people's hearts. The governor's arrival brought media attention, but the real stories were happening in small moments throughout the festival. Mrs. Rodriguez was teaching a group of young mothers her secret recipes in the community kitchen. Former troublemakers were now guiding visitors, sharing their stories of transformation with pride. In the Innovation Center's main hall, a special exhibition showcased the community's journey. Photos and videos documented the changes, from that first confrontation in the store to the present day. But it was the wall of small kindnesses that drew the most attention, a collection of handwritten notes describing countless everyday acts of compassion that had become the norm on Pine Street. As afternoon turned to evening, the festival transformed into a community dinner. Tables lined the street, bringing together people who, just months ago, might never have spoken to each other. The governor sat between Mr. Rodriguez and one of the former troublemakers, listening intently to their stories. Alex found a quiet moment to sit with his uncle on their familiar store steps. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" he asked. His uncle smiled. "You know what your grandfather used to say? The smallest light can dispel the greatest darkness. That day when you stood up for the Rodriguez couple, that was your light. Everything else," he gestured to the vibrant scene before them, "just followed that first spark." Linda joined them, holding a tablet. "You need to see this," she said excitedly. "The national news is running a feature on Pine Street. Communities across the country are reaching out, wanting to learn from our model." But Alex's attention was drawn to a smaller scene nearby. One of the youngest program participants, a 12-year-old girl, was helping an elderly man with his smartphone. The man was frustrated, on the verge of giving up, but the girl was patient, encouraging, treating him with the same respect she'd want someone to show her grandparents. "That's it," Alex said softly. "That's what it's all about." The festival continued into the evening, strings of lights illuminating the street that had once been dark and empty. The community stage showcased local talents, young rappers performing with a senior citizens choir, traditional dancers teaching their moves to eager learners, stories being shared across generations. Near the end of the night, Richard Wellington called for everyone's attention. "When we first came to Pine Street, we thought we were here to help a community in need. What we found instead was a community that just needed a chance to help itself. The real change didn't come from our funding or programs, it came from the heart of Pine Street itself." He paused, looking around at the gathered faces. "Today, we're announcing the expansion of the National Community Renewal Initiative to 20 more cities. But more importantly, we're sending Pine Street residents as mentors to these communities, because they understand something profound, that true community renewal starts with simple acts of kindness and courage." After the speeches, as people began to head home, Alex noticed Mr. and Mrs. Rodriguez sitting on a bench, holding hands and watching the scene with contentment. He joined them, remembering that day 6 months ago that had changed everything. "You know," Mrs. Rodriguez said, patting his hand, "we thought we were just your elderly neighbors who needed help. We never imagined we'd become part of something so much bigger." Mr. Rodriguez nodded. "But that's how community works, isn't it? Every person matters. Every act of kindness counts. Every moment of courage can spark a change." As the last festival-goers departed and the cleanup crews, a mix of young and old volunteers working together, began their work, Alex took one final walk down Pine Street. The Innovation Center stood proud, its lights still glowing. The once empty storefronts now housed thriving businesses. The sidewalks that had been deserted were filled with traces of the day's joy. His phone buzzed with messages from youth program participants sharing photos and stories from the festival. Each image showed something special, not just the big moments, but the small ones, a child helping an elderly woman carry her shopping, teenagers teaching seniors to dance, former rivals working together to make their community better. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, and new chances to make a difference. But tonight, Pine Street stood as a testament to what was possible when one person chose to stand up for what was right, when a community chose to believe in itself, and when people chose to care for each other. The street lights cast a warm glow on the scene, and somewhere in the distance, music still played. Pine Street's darkness had been transformed into light, its silence into song, its isolation into connection. And it had all started with a single moment of courage in a small grocery store, proof that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness could spark the greatest changes.